Hi class, welcome to our next lesson. So in this one, we're going to be talking more in depth about the Progressive Era and the Muckrakers, which we've kind of touched on slightly, but we're going to talk more about some individuals who are known as Muckrakers. So let's get started. So let's start with an overview first of what this era is, what's it about, and what's so significant about it and makes it different and unique. So the period of U.S. history from the 1890s to the 1920s is usually called the Progressive Era, and it's an era known for intense social and political reform, with the goal of making progress towards a better society. And these progressive era reformers, they wanted to use the power of the federal government to try to eliminate or reduce as much as possible unethical and unfair business practices. They wanted to reduce corruption and to counteract the negative effects of industrialization. And the other thing about this era is that during this era, protections for workers and consumers were strengthened. And another big thing to remember during this period, women finally achieved the right to vote. So let's talk a little bit about the problems of industrialization. So even though we know that industrialization in the United States, it did raise standards of living for many people, and it had more work, people were making money, um, but it did have a dark side. So corporate bosses, which were sometimes referred to as robber barons during this period, they pursued unfair and unethical business practices. And really, the goal of these practices was to eliminate competition as much as possible and to increase profits. So, think of the monopolists that we learned about in the previous unit. Also, a big thing, factory workers, many of them who were recent immigrants, they were frequently subjected to brutal and dangerous working and living conditions during this time because of industrialization. And political corruption during this period was rampant, as we learned about in the previous unit, and it enriched politicians at the expense of the lower and working classes who really struggled to make ends meet. And during the Gilded Age, as we learned, the gap between the haves and the have nots, the gap between the rich and the poor, was widening. So, because of all of these problems that I just mentioned, the progressive movement really arose as a response to those negative effects of industrialization. And progressive reformers, they wanted to address these problems by regulating private industry, strengthening protections for workers and consumers, exposing corruption in both government and in big business. And in general, they just wanted to work to improve society overall. And here is a political cartoon criticizing the robber barons. I've actually showed this to you before in the previous unit. And it's a cartoon criticizing the robber barons of industry for profiting off of workers who were poorly paid and subjected to dangerous and harsh conditions. And this was created in 1883. So just before the Progressive Era. So these were some of the issues that we was were existed in the United States during this time. So let's talk a little bit about the ideology and politics of progressivism. What does it mean to be a progressive? So the worldview of progressive reformers during this period was based on certain key assumptions. The first assumption was that human nature could be improved through the enlightened application of regulations, incentives, and punishments. So that means that they believed that through legislation, through writing and creating laws, using government created regulations and laws and incentives and punishments, that they could improve human nature that way. The second key assumption was that the power of the federal government, right? The federal government meaning the United States government, the national government, not your state government, right? Not your local government, but the federal government. Their assumption was that the power of the federal government could be used to improve the individual and to transform society for the better. And these two assumptions were not shared by many people, some Americans, and some of them were political conservatives. And they tended to believe, conservatives tend to believe, that human nature is unchanging and that the federal government should remain limited, should remain smaller in size and in scope, which is contrasted greatly with progressives, right? As you can see. And let's talk about some progressive reformers during this period. So, some of the most famous progressive reformers were Jane Addams, and she's famous, as we learned in the previous unit. She founded Hull House in Chicago, which was meant to help immigrants to adapt to life in the United States. And then you have Ida Tarbell, who was a muckraker who exposed the corrupt business practices of Standard Oil, which was the monopoly that was owned by John D. Rockefeller, remember? And so she exposed their corrupt business practices of John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. And she really became an early pioneer in investigative journalism, right? And exposing the corruption, right? And then you have Presidents Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, both progressive presidents, and they both expanded the power, they grew the power of the federal government. They imposed regulations. That means that they created and signed laws to regulate private industry, private business, and to implement protections for workers, consumers, and the natural environment. That's a big thing too, creating national parks and preserving the environment, right? So here is Ida Tarbell. She's the pioneer of investigative journalism, and she's the one who published an expose on Standard Oil's unfair business practices, right? So she criticized Standard Oil. Now let's talk a little bit about the muckrakers, since I mentioned one of them. So the muckrakers were journalists and novelists of the Progressive Era, and they wanted to expose corruption in big business and government. And the work of these people, the muckrakers, influenced the passage of key legislation, key laws that helped to strengthen protections for workers and consumers. And some of the most famous muckrakers were women, including Ida Tarbell, who I mentioned, and then another one named Ida B. Wells. So let's talk a little bit about this book. We'll talk about first. There's a male muckraker, and his name is Upton St. Clair. So the first one is The Jungle. This is his novel. And here's a quote from his novel. It says, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." So that was Upton St. Clair. He was complaining a little bit. He was lamenting the fact that his fictionalized account, The Jungle, which it was an account of the corruption and contamination in Chicago's meatpacking industry. And he was just commenting on the fact that he had gotten such a strong reaction from the public. So Sinclair was one of the most famous muckrakers of the Progressive Era, and he wrote The Jungle in 1905. And again, it's this fictionalized account of the corruption and contamination in the meatpacking industry in Chicago. And the goal of his book was to raise public awareness of the exploitation and foul conditions in which workers in the meatpacking industry were working and subjected to. Now, ironically, though, what most readers who read The Jungle were worried about and concerned about was not the trials and tribulations and the horrible working conditions and the exploitation of the industrial workers working in these factories. But most readers were actually more concerned with the novel's description of meat contamination. And the public was so outraged, there was such an outcry, that it actually led to the passage of something called the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And both of these laws established federal regulations over the food and drug industries. And by drugs, I mean medicine, right? And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So here is a picture of some meat inspection. It says splitting backbones and final inspection. So they're inspecting hogs there in that picture, and they're ready to be sent to the cooler. And so before Congress passed the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, this wasn't a common thing. You didn't have people inspecting meat in this way. So let's talk a little bit about the term muckraker, right? Raking the muck is really the quote here. So the term muckraker was popularized in 1906 by Theodore Roosevelt when he was delivering a speech, and he suggested that the quote unquote, you can see the quote on the screen, the men with the muck rakes are often indispensable to the well being of society, but only if they know when to stop raking the muck. And so, in this context, raking the muck really refers to the practices of investigative journalists and activists who brought the unpleasant muck of corruption in government and big business to the surface, right? So they brought all that corruption and big business to the surface for everybody to see. So some of the most famous progressive muckrakers were women. The first is Ida Tarbell, and she was a teacher, an author, and a journalist. And she published a series of articles in a magazine, in McClure's magazine in 1902. And these articles really became the foundation for a book that she wrote later called The History of the Standard Oil Company. And this book was published in 1904, and it really portrayed and depicted the oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller as a greedy, miserly monopolist. And the book quickly became a bestseller, and it actually established Ida Tarbell, as an early pioneer of investigative journalism. And then you have Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells, she was an African American journalist and suffragist. So that means, when I say suffragist, that means that she fought for the right to vote, right? And she was African American. She was an influential female muckraker. And she had been born into slavery in Mississippi in 1862. So she was born a slave. And in the 1890s, she became involved in anti-lynching activism. So in 1892, she published something called The Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. And this detailed the systematic disenfranchisement of Southern blacks. And this means that she wrote about and she exposed the way in which Southern blacks were prevented from being able to exercise their right to vote. And she actually even covered the fact that some poor whites were being prevented and disenfranchised. That's what that word disenfranchised means, to be prevented from voting. So Wells, Ida B. Wells, she was very influential in the early movement for civil rights. And she was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which is an organization that would fight for and advocate for African Americans in their civil rights. And that was in 1909. And so here is a picture of Ida B. Wells, the influential muckraker, who wrote about the horrors of lynch law in the American South. And then you have Jacob Riis. So muckrakers also wanted to raise awareness of poverty and other social problems associated with industrialization. And so Jacob Riis, here you can see on the screen, he was a Danish immigrant, so he was from Denmark, and he was a photojournalist. And he published an 18-page photo essay, and it was called How the Other Half Lives. And this is actually really famous. And it first appeared in February 1889 in a magazine, and the following year it was published as a book. And the photos in this book, they really documented the harsh living conditions of recent immigrants in New York City. And the photos were so upsetting and graphic, and they actually inspired reforms such as the New York Tenement House Act of 1901. And this act basically required tenement housing to be cleaner, to be safer for the people living there, and to be more spacious. And so here is a famous picture. We saw this in the previous unit, and this was actually one of the pictures taken by Jacob Riis. and one of the ones that was exposing the horrible conditions, the harsh living conditions of the immigrants living in New York City. So let's talk a little bit about some specific reforms, right, from the progressives, right? So progressive reformers successfully influenced the passage of many pieces of substantial legislation. That means substantial as in important, influential, and it included several amendments to the US Constitution. So the first was the 16th Amendment, and this amendment established a federal income tax. So the federal government would tax you on your income each year, right? And then you have the 17th Amendment, which allowed for the direct popular election of senators. That meant the people could democratically vote for their senators. Remember, in our previous lesson, we learned that these senators used to be elected by the state legislatures. So they were indirectly elected. And so now, under the 17th Amendment, it allowed for the direct election of senators by the people. And this continues to this day. And then you have the 18th Amendment. And this amendment prohibited the sales of alcohol, right? And then the 19th Amendment. This amendment is a big one to remember. Remember it for the test. The 19th Amendment guaranteed women the right to vote. So legislation aimed at strengthening protections for workers and consumers also included the Pure Food and Drug Act, which I mentioned when I was talking about Upton St. Clair and the jungle. And this act created the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, if you've heard that before. And basically, this is meant to guarantee the safety and purity of all food products and pharmaceuticals or medicines in the United States that are sold in the United States. And then also another one is the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. And basically, this act sought to curb business practices that were aimed at stifling competition, right? So it attempted to eliminate things like price discrimination, price fixing, and unfair business practices that were preventing that free market competition that really should exist. Small business owners pretty much had no chance to survive against some of these big monopolies, right? So the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 was trying to address that issue of monopolies. And so here is it's a pretty it's a I believe an ad for toothache drops, as you can see, and it contained cocaine in the drops. So, is your baby keeping you up at night? Maybe calm them down with this soothing drop, this soothing syrup that's laced with, some moderate amounts of cocaine or opium, right? Why don't you just do that? Or, do you have a problem with your heart or your kidney or your stomach? Why don't you just take this remedy that will cure you like magic? Are you balding maybe? Or are you losing your hair? Why don't you just wipe some of this like special potion on your head, and just like that, you'll be cured? Or, would you maybe like to see what's being put inside your food? Oh, too bad. We're not really going to share our secret, but just trust us. Or, would you like to try this bottle of ketchup preserved with formaldehyde, which is the same chemical used to treat warts, right? All those questions I just asked you, those scenarios, they seem ridiculous, even by like today's standards. But really, prior to the Food and Drug Act of 1906, all of these products and all of these practices were in place. And really, the Pure Food and Drug Act was the first piece of legislation in the country that really sought to regulate drugs and food, pharmaceuticals, medicine products by requiring them to label their products, to create inspectors of the food and drug manufacturing process. And it actually created a list of 10 dangerous drugs that had to be labeled at all times. And it came about during this progressive era of American history. And it's something that we take for granted to this day, unfortunately. But it was a very beneficial reform sought and passed by progressives. So let's talk a little bit about the dark side of progressivism. So even though progressive reformers, they achieved many noteworthy, important goals and achievements during this period. They also promoted, unfortunately, discriminatory policies, and some of them espoused and advanced intolerant ideas. So, for example, the Wilson administration, remember Woodrow Wilson, I just mentioned a few minutes ago, when he was president, his administration, even though they supposedly they embraced this idea of progress and modernity, they pursued a racial agenda, and this racial agenda really culminated in the segregation of the federal government, racial segregation of the federal government. And actually, during his presidency, between the years 1913 and 1921, the United States saw a revival of the Ku Klux Klan. And there was like a vicious racist backlash against the economic and political gains that were being made by African Americans in the post Reconstruction period, right? So African Americans were doing better, and you had this backlash. You had the growth of the KKK, and he didn't do enough to try to put a stop to it, unfortunately. And then labor unions. So labor unions, they were very active in progressive politics. And unfortunately, they played a role, and they supported restrictions on immigration. And some labor unions and labor union leaders, they spewed xenophobic rhetoric. And xenophobic means, to hate and to discriminate against those who are foreigners. And so they spewed this xenophobic rhetoric that blamed immigrants for all their problems, for low wages and for the harsh working conditions in factories across the country. And because they were complaining so much, and labor unions were so strong and powerful, they helped to get policies, federal laws, federal immigration laws, to get passed in the Progressive Era. And one of them, actually two of them, one of them was the Immigration Act of 1917, and the other was the National Quota Law of 1921. And these severely limited immigration to the United States based on nationality. Depending on where you came from, you might not be allowed in the country. And basically, it excluded virtually all Asian immigrants from coming to the United States. And then the other thing is, in line with their view of human nature, right? They viewed human nature as capable of being engineered and manipulated, right? They believed that you could improve human nature, you could better human nature, improve society, right? Alongside that, many progressive reformers also advocated for selective breeding, or eugenics. That's what they're called. Eugenics was considered this science of better breeding. And the goal was to improve the genetic quality of the human population through policies that would encourage basically the more supposedly desirable elements of society, which I mentioned in the previous lesson, right? So the Anglo-Saxon white Christian elements of society. It would encourage them to have more children while preventing undesirables, so non-whites, from reproducing. And so eugenics was based on a racial as well as class hierarchy. So it placed white Anglo-Saxon Protestants at the top, whereas lower classes, ethnic minorities, recent immigrants, the mentally ill, and the developmentally disabled, they were all pretty much viewed as lower, right? They were the lower rungs on this hierarchy. And actually, in 1907, the United States became the very first country in the world to pass a compulsory sterilization law. And this law basically meant that certain people would be sterilized, meaning they would not, and it would be forced, by the way, meaning that they would not be able to have children, right? It would be a medical procedure that would prevent them from having children. And so the genocidal policies, of Nazi Germany, which you will talk about in spring semester, those genocidal policies ultimately discredited the science of eugenics, right? So it lost popularity. A lot of people were like, whoa, this went too far. This was wrong. When everyone saw what happened in Nazi Germany. But it wasn't before over 60,000 American men and women had been forcibly sterilized between 1907 and when that policy came to an end. So beginning in 1907, the United States had that compulsory sterilization law. And over the course of the years that was in effect, 60,000 American men and women were sterilized to prevent them from having children, right? So I want to know what you think. Overall, given everything you've just learned, do you think the effects of progressivism were more harmful or beneficial to American society? So let me know, and then let me know if you have any questions about the lesson.